Hi, my name is David Horner, and I have been a pastor of a church for the last 40 years, leading them to understand the mission that God has given us as a congregation to make Christ known, not just in the neighborhoods, but to the nations. And so what I want to do is take the next 15 minutes or so and just kind of walk through some things with you that might help you in the process of discerning what God would have you do in the area of missions. I pastored Providence Baptist Church here in Raleigh, North Carolina for 37 years, and then changed roles after 37 years in 2016 and began a ministry called Equip for Life. The goal of Equip for Life is to help pastors, missionaries, Christian leaders excel in the work that they're doing, as I find ways to be able to help them become more adept at reaching the nations with the gospel of Christ. So whether it's in the local congregation or whether it's in pastors' conferences around the world, God has given me opportunities to see firsthand what it means for the Bible to be put into practice in the lives of folks right here in our own city and in places around the world. So during the 40 years or so that God's given me the privilege of shepherding the flock, He has also given me the opportunity of visiting about 40 different countries around the world. And for a guy who grew up in a small town in North Carolina, didn't really see much prospect of ever getting much further than an hour from home, God has given us as a family, my wife and I, and all of our sons, opportunities to see the gospel at work around the world. And so we want to take the next little time and answer some questions for you. We've got 3 specific things we want to ask, and we want to give you an opportunity to listen, understand more of what we're talking about, and then at the end, offer you some resources. Let me suggest a few reasons as to why so many churches give so little attention to the great missions endeavor that Christ has given us in the Great Commission. There are a lot of different ways to explain why. Some of them are as basic as just selfishness. We're more concerned about our own agenda than what Christ has given us for the nations. But there are some other realities that we have to come to grips with. The first is just the product of our age. We live in an eclectic world where no one wants to admit that anything is absolutely true, and so that has impacted churches. Truth is, there are many in evangelical congregations, Bible-believing churches these days, who have a hard time coming to grips with the fact that Jesus Christ is really the only way of salvation. He's the only way for a person to be able to know God. And as a result of that reticence to claim that, they're not convinced that they need to go and make disciples of the nations and introduce people to Christ all over the world. They figure somehow or another they're going to find a way to know Christ in spite of the fact that the Scriptures teach us that Jesus is the only way. If that's true, and we believe it is to be true, then another reason that people are not actively engaging in missions in their churches is reality. They have no compassion for lost people. And they have their salvation. They're excited about being able to know that they belong to Christ. They know that their eternal destiny has been sealed forever. So why would they not have concern, compassion for people around the world whose eternities are up for grabs as far as whether or not they will spend eternity with Christ or be condemned forever apart from Christ in a place He calls hell? Without any compassion for lost people, how are we going to have a desire to go ahead and take the message of the cross, the message of the gospel to the nations? So, 1, people are not that convinced that Jesus is the only way. That's one explanation. 2, they don't really have much of a compassion for lost people if they don't really care, both here at home and across the world. Thirdly, it's kind of hard to find models. Out of all the church growth information and all the conferences and things that go on around us, it's really sad, but so many of the models are about reproducing large churches here in the States or in the West, and there's little focus, a little modeling of a desire to take the Great Commission seriously and take the message to the nations. So in Acts 1:8, when Jesus says right before He ascends to heaven, I want to make sure that you understand that when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, you'll be my witnesses, both in Jerusalem, field 1, right where you live, Judea and Samaria, that's the same general cultural context, perhaps the same geographic and language group and basic cultures, and then to the ends or the uttermost part of the world. Well, with that reality there, we know that we have to have a message that is taking the message everywhere. Having pastored a church for many years, there were always voices saying, why are we spending so much money on missions when there are so many lost people right here in our own city? And the answer is clearly, Jesus told us to do that. He says the message is not just for us and our kin and our neighborhoods, but we're to take the message to the nations. So a lot of churches have not modeled it in any way that's discernible that they have a real passion for the nations. One of the other realities is that there is a sense in which we're not really convinced that Jesus wanted us to go. And there was some reinventing of the Great Commission in a lot of circles over the last several decades. They give us the idea that somehow or another we can just stay where we are and the nations will be reached somehow mysteriously by somebody else without us making any efforts to go. Part of it has to do with understanding of the Great Commission that says, rightfully so, that there's only one imperative there, and that is to make disciples. But the beginning of that verse with "as you go" is something that we have to understand is a part of the process of making disciples, going in order to be able to make disciples. And so there's some confusion these days, and people use language that is further confusing things. They talk about the mission of the church, by which they're really talking about the purpose, not missions in terms of taking the gospel around the world. They talk about being missional, which means that all the things that the church is doing are intended to link people up from where they are to where the gospel speaks to their world. And then there's missions, taking the message outside the local church around the world, from neighborhoods to nation, Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria to the uttermost parts. And so we want to be able to be convinced that the commission is for us. And the order in which Jesus has stressed these things to be followed are indeed as germane today as they've ever been. So that's one of the reasons why so many churches are giving so little attention to reaching the nations and preferring to spend most of that on their own terms, in their own hometowns, on themselves. A great question that every believer ought to be asking in our day is, what can we do to build a better missions context, a mindset in the local church of which we're part? If you're the pastor, it makes sense that you can do a lot of proactive things to make that happen. If you're just a member, it's not quite as easy to do that, but you still are not at a loss. You can find ways to make a difference. So, several years ago, I was asked to write a book called When Missions Shapes the Mission. And it talks about the fact that you and your church can reach the world. So you and your church, in order to do that, have a lot of different options before you, things that have been tried and true methods all through the ages. One of the things we did in putting the book together was do a survey of 300 different churches around the country who responded back saying, here's how we have kept a strong missions climate in our church. And so let me just share a couple of these with you and just start thinking through how these might work to help you do that same thing in your congregation. Whether you're the pastor or just an interested staff member, or if you're just a member of the local church, you can make a difference in advancing the cause of missions in your church. First thing that we found at our church years ago is that we could adopt a people group. Many, many years ago, we chose to adopt a people group in Central Asia. We began praying for them, learning about their culture, finding out what we could about how we can reach them with the gospel. And next thing you know, the Lord's opening doors for our people to actually be involved in Central Asian types of ministry in and around the people group that we adopted. It was a great way for our people to connect with missions in a very personal, realistic way. A second way we can do it, besides just adopting a people group, if you can have someone in your congregation who is designated to be the point person for missions. If everybody's in charge of it, then nobody is. Some of the churches that we contacted in our survey says, well, everybody in our church is a missionary, so we don't have any specific process by which we go about doing it. That didn't work. And they were not really doing anything outside of their own community. And they considered themselves a missional church, which was good, but they had no real missions interest beyond the doors of their own congregation and their own community. And so you need to have someone who is the designated person advocating for missions in your congregation. Third is a way that we have found extremely helpful through the years. A lot of controversy about it, a lot of people asking questions, and it's a very simple thing to support mission trips. Having people from your congregation actually go overseas or to a nearby city or up into the mountains somewhere, or finding some place for them to be actively hands in the dirt, feet on the ground, missions-oriented people. What we started praying is that not just that we would send people out on some kind of adventure, that they would take a big trip somewhere. That's not what we're looking for. Nor did we think that it was going to help if we took all the money that we spent on mission trips and sent that overseas. There was no money. The only money that they were spending was on the trips themselves. And so we started praying that God would give us an opportunity to send numbers of people. And over the course of these many years, we have sent thousands of our people on trips overseas. We started praying that God would allow us to experience the joy of watching a tithe, or 10% of those who go, end up seeing and having a passion for and going themselves to be a part of some kind of vocational missions ministry over the course of their lives. During one 10-year period of time, we had over 100 of our members go overseas in missions, all of whom had been on mission trips, which stirred their interest and piqued their desires to be faithful in going forth with the gospel. So support for mission trips is huge, greatly important things for you to be involved with as a church. We want to make sure, lastly, that we can do this in a local church, and your pastor can help you do this, and that is give regular visibility to missions from the platform or in the pulpit during worship times on a regular basis. That doesn't mean he spends every few weeks preaching a missions message. That's not necessary. Although it doesn't hurt at all to have a missions focus in his preaching from time to time. And so you can do it that way. You can have opportunities to have annual missions weekends. We had missions festivals every year, and it turned out to be one of the most exciting weekends of the year. We want to also find ways on the platform to recognize and commission individuals and teams who are either going full-time or are going on short-term trips or doing whatever they want to do, need to do, to be a part of the Great Commission themselves. And last thing you can do is make sure that there's an opportunity for the pastor, if he's got a passion for it, to go personally. And then while he's gone, his very absence from the pulpit speaks of missions and its emphasis and its importance to the church. So there's a variety of ways that the church can give emphasis from the platform to missions, and we encourage you to do so and do it in a way that will give missions the priority in your local church and in your own life. When it gets right down to it, this becomes a very personal issue, and you need to figure out how or when God has called you to be personally engaged to take a more active role in missions. So here's the encouragement. Find a project, find a trip, and go yourself. If you can't afford to do that, find someone in your congregation who is going and find out how you can support them. Praying for them, financially giving what you can to help them take the trip, and recognizing that God has a way for all of us to be involved in reaching the nations with the gospel. So find a trip or project yourself or someone who's going that you can encourage along those ways. Pray for and give sacrificially to support missions in some kind of tangible way. Huge, huge engagement of your heart where your money and your prayer time is going. One of the last things you can do is just to answer some questions of yourself and answer them honestly. The first is, am I willing to go and do whatever it is that God puts before me? So if God asks me to do something and my first response is negative, that's not the call of a disciple. So we want to be able to ask, would I do, would I go, would I be anything that God calls me to be? Answer that as honestly as you can. Second thing is, do I trust Him if I do give Him my yes and put that on the table? Do I trust that He is going to provide everything I need to make that happen? That's one of the greatest fears that we have, is that we'll say yes and then God will put us out on a limb and then chop the limb off behind us. God will provide. He will take care of our needs as we go. And we'll use whatever means at His disposal, and He has the whole world and the whole universe at His disposal to make it possible for us to fulfill our mission.